The bell above the door gave a faint metallic jingle as she stepped into the gun shop, the kind of sound that made heads turn even when no one wanted to be obvious about it. The shop smelled of oiled metal, gunpowder residue, and old leather, a mixture that seasoned hunters and veterans often found comforting. But for Clara, it was alien, overwhelming, almost suffocating. She was a simple woman, plain in her dress, with shoes that had seen better days and a cardigan that looked like it belonged more in a library than in a place lined with rifles, pistols, and shelves of ammunition. Her hair was tied back in a modest bun, streaks of gray betraying her age, and her purse was small, clutched tight to her side as though she feared someone might snatch it away. To the men leaning against the glass counter and the younger clerks cleaning barrels behind the display, she looked laughably out of place. Their chuckles started low, little whispers bouncing back and forth, the kind of quiet ridicule people used when they thought someone wasn't supposed to belong. "Lost, Grandma?" one of the men muttered loud enough for his friends to hear, and they snickered. Another called out, "Knitting needles are down the street." Clara heard them, of course she did, but she walked with quiet, deliberate steps toward the far end of the counter, her eyes scanning the displays not with ignorance, but with a kind of focus that unsettled the manager behind the register. He had seen farmers, veterans, weekend hobbyists, survivalists, he thought he'd seen them all. But this woman, fragile-looking as she seemed, had an air of intention that didn't fit the easy mockery being thrown her way. The mockery didn't stop. One of the younger clerks, no older than 20, leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear, "Maybe she thinks this is a bakery." Laughter broke out again. Clara set her purse on the counter, ignoring them, and studied the revolvers laid neatly in the case below the glass. The manager cleared his throat, more out of politeness than interest. "Ma'am," he said, "can I help you with something?" He half expected her to ask if they sold pepper spray or maybe something ridiculous like a whistle. Instead, Clara's voice came, soft but steady, "I'd like to see that Colt Python. 6-inch barrel. Nickel finish." The room quieted a little at that. The clerk who had been smirking froze with his rag halfway down the barrel of a shotgun. The manager blinked, a small frown pulling at his lips. "That's a heavy revolver," he said cautiously. "Not exactly the kind of piece most beginners ask for." Clara tilted her head, her eyes steady. "I didn't say I was a beginner." Her words landed heavier than a hammer on steel. The silence after them seemed to stretch out, and then came a nervous laugh from the corner, an attempt to shake off the strange shift. "Lady, you sure you even know what that is?" one of the customers said. Clara didn't bother answering him. Her gaze never moved from the manager. Finally, with a sigh and a shake of his head, he unlocked the case and laid the revolver on a velvet mat before her. The Colt Python gleamed under the fluorescent lights, polished, elegant, deadly. Clara reached out, her fingers not trembling, not fumbling. She lifted it with the careful ease of someone who had handled such weight before. The laughter in the shop had died completely now, replaced by curious stares. She checked the revolver, opened the cylinder, examined each chamber with the precision of habit, not novelty. "Smooth rotation," she murmured to herself, almost as though she were inspecting produce at a market. Her thumb brushed the hammer, her eyes narrowing slightly as though testing tension she remembered from long ago. The men who had mocked her now watched in silence, their smirks gone. One of them shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his friend as if to ask silently, "Who is this woman?" Clara lowered the weapon back to the mat with care and looked up at the manager. "Do you allow testing on the range?" she asked. "Of course," the manager replied slowly, studying her. His tone had shifted now, cautious, respectful in a way he hadn't expected. "But it'll cost you for the ammunition." Clara nodded, pulling her purse closer and setting a neatly folded wad of bills on the counter. "That won't be a problem." She spoke as though she'd known before she walked in exactly how this conversation would unfold. The clerk who had joked about bakeries cleared his throat nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. Something about her quiet composure made it hard to laugh anymore. She didn't have the swagger of a gun enthusiast or the bravado of a collector. She carried herself like someone who had already proven everything she needed to, years ago. They led her to the range, the long fluorescent-lit room lined with booths and thick glass dividers. The other customers followed, curiosity outweighing their errands. It wasn't every day you saw a cardigan-wearing woman in her late 50s or early 60s command the attention of an entire gun shop. Clara stood in her booth, set her purse down, and accepted the earmuffs from the manager. She loaded the revolver with the smooth, practiced movements of memory. The bullets slid into place one by one, no hesitation. The young clerk who had mocked her earlier leaned forward, trying to see if her hands shook, if her grip faltered. They didn't. Clara extended her arms, feet planted in a stance that was neither awkward nor borrowed. It was drilled, familiar. She squeezed the trigger once. The revolver barked, the sound echoing down the range, sharp and authoritative. The first shot punched dead center into the target's chest outline. The second followed a breath later, then the third, each shot smooth, unhurried. By the time the sixth round thundered, the target paper flapped with holes clustered so tightly together that the men behind her muttered in disbelief. She set the revolver down, calmly opened the cylinder, and began reloading. No wasted movements, no showing off. Just calm, precise efficiency. The room, once filled with jeers, was now so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed loud. Nobody dared laugh anymore. Even the ones who wanted to dismiss her as lucky knew better. Luck didn't group shots that tight. Clara emptied the cylinder again, 6 clean shots, every single one landing where she intended. The manager folded his arms, leaning back with an expression that was half admiration, half unease. "You've done this before," he said flatly. Clara finally turned her head slightly, looking at him with eyes that carried a weight of memory, of things unsaid. "A long time ago," she replied softly. She didn't elaborate, and the silence that followed told everyone that maybe they didn't want her to. The man who had made the bakery joke swallowed hard, suddenly finding his shoes very interesting. Another customer muttered, "Damn," under his breath, shaking his head. Clara placed the revolver back on the mat, removed the earmuffs, and straightened her cardigan like she was preparing to leave a library, not a gun range. Her purse snapped shut with a tidy little click. She didn't look at the men around her, didn't acknowledge the shift in the air, but she didn't need to. 60 minutes had not yet passed since she walked in the door, but already nobody dared move or speak the way they had before. They had seen enough to understand something unspoken. This woman wasn't to be mocked. The murmurs lingered in the air like smoke as Clara walked back toward the counter, every pair of eyes following her in silence. The Colt Python rested in her hand, unloaded now, the cylinder hanging open, but she carried it with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to wave it around to prove authority. When she placed it gently back on the velvet mat, the manager instinctively straightened his shoulders, as though he were in the presence of someone who deserved deference. "That was impressive," he admitted, the understatement hanging between them like a challenge. Clara gave a slight smile, almost shy, but it wasn't the smile of someone seeking praise. It was the kind of smile that came from having nothing left to prove. "It's a fine weapon," she said simply. "Balanced, steady, forgiving in the hands of someone who listens to it." The way she spoke about the gun made the clerk closest to her glance uneasily at the manager. It wasn't bravado, wasn't obsession. It was reverence, like the words of someone who understood the unspoken language of steel and powder. The younger clerk, who only an hour earlier had thought her ridiculous, found himself unconsciously stepping back, as though giving her space might shield him from the weight of his own earlier mockery. The manager cleared his throat, still studying her. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. His tone was careful now, not prying but searching. Clara's eyes shifted slightly, not meeting his gaze, as though the question unlocked a door she had long ago nailed shut. "The kind of place that teaches you not to miss," she said softly. "Nothing more." She reached into her purse and set down another folded stack of bills. "I'll take it." "And 2 boxes of .357 Magnum rounds." The words stunned the room into deeper silence. The men behind her, who had once laughed, exchanged uneasy glances. Owning a weapon like the Colt Python wasn't just a hobbyist's whim, it was a declaration. The manager hesitated. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this isn't the sort of piece people buy lightly." Clara's hand, resting on her purse, didn't waver. "Neither is survival." Something in her voice made the hair rise on the back of more than one neck in that room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, but it carried the weight of a truth that no one dared laugh at. The paperwork was signed in silence. The background check went through without a hitch, though Clara waited with patient stillness as the system ticked away. While she sat on the bench by the counter, the other customers loitered nearby, pretending to browse while stealing glances at her. She seemed so ordinary again, her cardigan, her modest shoes, her quiet posture, but the image of the target full of tight bullet holes hung in their minds, refusing to reconcile with the simple woman before them. One man leaned toward another, whispering, "You think she was military?" His friend shook his head, whispering back, "Not just military. That kind of control? That special forces or something close." They were guessing, filling in the silence with speculation, because none of them could stand the thought that they had mocked someone so clearly dangerous, so clearly disciplined. Clara, for her part, sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, as though none of it mattered anymore. When the paperwork was complete, the manager slid the revolver case toward her. "She's yours now," he said almost reluctantly. Clara nodded, placed it gently into her bag and tucked the boxes of ammunition beside it. She rose, thanked him with the same politeness one might give a librarian for lending a book, and turned toward the door. Not a single person dared speak as she walked past. The bell above the frame jingled again, but this time it rang into a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone's chest. Clara stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the weight of her purchase slung lightly on her shoulder, as if it were no different than a bag of groceries. For her maybe it wasn't. But inside the shop the silence broke at last. "What the hell just happened?" one of the men whispered, his voice trembling between awe and unease. Another ran a hand over his face. "We laughed at her. And she, he trailed off, not finding the words. The younger clerk swallowed hard. "She put 6 shots through a target cleaner than I've ever seen. Twice. And she didn't even flinch." His voice cracked slightly, his earlier arrogance gone. The manager leaned on the counter, staring at the door as though expecting Clara to walk back in at any moment. "You idiots don't even realize," he muttered. "That wasn't just skill. That was training. Years of it. That woman's seen things none of us ever will." The realization sent a chill through the group. For the next several minutes, nobody dared joke or sneer. The bravado that usually filled the shop had evaporated, replaced with a strange, reverent fear. They all had the same thought gnawing at the back of their minds: why now? Why had this quiet woman, who clearly carried a past soaked in discipline and survival, walked in today to buy a revolver? They didn't know, and none of them dared to ask her. One thing was certain: no one who had seen her that day would ever mock her again. Because Clara had walked in like a grandmother with a shopping list, and she had walked out like a ghost from a world they couldn't imagine. Outside, Clara moved down the street with unhurried steps, the world passing her by as though she were invisible. Children laughed from a park across the road, a bus hissed to a stop, and a couple argued over groceries by their car. To anyone watching, she was just another middle-aged woman heading home with a bag over her shoulder. But inside her mind, memories she had buried long ago stirred awake: the crack of distant gunfire, the weight of responsibility, the faces of comrades long gone. She had sworn she would never touch a weapon again, had promised herself a quiet life of simplicity. But the world had shifted, and sometimes old ghosts called you back. Today in that gun shop she hadn't just bought a revolver. She had reopened a chapter of her life she had fought desperately to close. And as she walked into the fading sunlight, the city oblivious around her, she knew that 60 minutes in that shop had changed everything, for her, and for anyone foolish enough to underestimate her again. Clara's house sat at the edge of town, tucked behind a row of sycamore trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. From the outside it looked ordinary: white siding, a faded porch swing, flower pots lined with petunias she had tended for years. Neighbors saw her as quiet, dependable, the kind of woman who kept her garden neat and waved politely but never lingered for gossip. Inside, the house carried the same modest simplicity: shelves lined with old novels, framed photographs of landscapes instead of people, and furniture that had aged but never worn out. Yet when Clara stepped inside that evening, placing the revolver case on the kitchen table, the stillness of the house seemed to shift. It was as if a room long locked had suddenly been opened, letting the air stir with memories she had once buried. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her fingers resting on the case, not opening it yet. Her reflection in the kitchen window caught her attention: the faint lines on her face, the gray in her hair, and the eyes that still carried a sharpness most people overlooked. She remembered those same eyes years ago, staring back at her in a mirror framed by military barracks, before deployment, before loss, before she had chosen a quiet life. She let out a long breath and finally opened the case, the nickel finish gleaming under the overhead light. The revolver felt like an echo of her past, a tool she knew too well. She loaded a cylinder slowly, listening to the sound of each round sliding into place. It wasn't just the sound of metal, it was the sound of memory: late-night drills, live fire exercises, the bark of commands shouted over the thunder of weapons. She closed her eyes, and just for a moment she was back there, in the desert, the air heavy with heat and dust, her hands steady on the same weight of steel. She had walked away from all of that, sworn she would never return, but the world had a way of calling you back when you least wanted it. Clara set the revolver down and pressed her palms together tightly. Her mind drifted to the letter that had arrived 3 days earlier, the reason she had gone to that gun shop in the first place. It was folded neatly on the counter beside her purse, its words burned into her mind. The letter had not been signed with a name but with a symbol, one she hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. A circle with a line through it, drawn in sharp ink. It was the mark of a group she thought she'd left behind forever. Her pulse quickened just remembering it. The circle, what they had called themselves, were not just soldiers. They had been a covert unit, a black ops team so deep in secrecy that even most branches of government pretended they didn't exist. Clara had been one of them, one of the best, her quiet demeanor masking an unshakable discipline and dead-eye precision. The circle had carried out missions that never made the news, jobs too dirty or too dangerous to be acknowledged publicly. She had left after one mission went wrong, fatally wrong. Lives were lost, comrades gone, and Clara had carried the weight of that failure every day since. She walked away, disappeared into civilian life, burying herself in normalcy. Gardening, teaching at the library, pretending the world she had once lived in no longer existed. But the letter had shattered all of that. "We're coming," it read. "Not for you but for what you still have." Clara had stared at those words for hours, her hands trembling for the first time in years. They couldn't mean her, she thought at first. But then she remembered the files she had hidden, the information locked away in a box beneath her floorboards. She had sworn never to use it, but she had kept it, unable to destroy it even when she wanted to. It was proof, records of missions the Circle had carried out, things the world was never meant to know. And now, if they were resurfacing, if they were coming for her, then she knew exactly why. She pushed back her chair, walked across the kitchen, and knelt on the wooden floorboards by the pantry. With a practiced hand she pried up one plank and revealed the small lockbox hidden beneath. She lifted it out, set it on the counter, and unlocked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. Inside were files, photographs, coded discs, pieces of a life she had tried desperately to forget. Clara's hands lingered over them, the memories burning like coals. She closed the box again, locked it, and pressed her forehead to her hand. "So it begins again," she whispered. Outside her window, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights washing briefly across her house before vanishing. Clara stiffened, her instincts sharp even after years of quiet. She moved to the window, parting the curtain just slightly. The car rolled on, nothing suspicious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were already watching. She returned to the table, picked up the revolver, and set it within arm's reach. Her heart was steady now, no longer pounding, the way it had been when she was younger, preparing for deployment. The discipline returned as though it had never left. She sat there in the dim kitchen, the revolver gleaming beside her, and waited. For what, she wasn't sure. But she knew they would come. And when they did, she would be ready. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to remember the faces of the people she had once served with. Faces that still visited her in dreams, both comforting and haunting. There was Diaz, who used to laugh even in the darkest situations. Morgan, whose calm voice had steadied Clara during her first mission. And Rachel, who had been closer to Clara than anyone, almost like a sister. Rachel was the one who hadn't made it back from the mission that broke them all. Clara closed her eyes and whispered Rachel's name like a prayer. She wasn't sure if she was seeking forgiveness or strength. Perhaps both. The weight of the revolver beside her felt heavier, not because of its steel, but because of what it represented, the return of a world she had promised to leave behind. The night grew deeper, silence settling over the neighborhood, but Clara didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, every creak of the house keeping her alert, every sound outside tightening her senses. She knew the Circle. They didn't send warnings without intent. If they said they were coming, they were already on their way. She rose once more, checked every lock in the house, set extra bolts in place, and then returned to her chair, revolver in hand. The woman who had walked into a gun shop that afternoon as a simple figure of ridicule was gone. What remained now was the ghost of who she once was, disciplined, prepared, and unwilling to be mocked ever again. The first sound that woke her wasn't the creak of the house or the whisper of wind against the siding. It was softer, subtler, rubber soles pressing against earth, barely audible but undeniable to ears trained long ago to recognize such things. Clara's eyes snapped open. She hadn't fallen fully asleep, only drifted into that shallow half-rest soldiers learned in the field, where every sound was filtered through instinct. She reached for the revolver on the table, the cool steel sliding easily into her grip. Slowly, carefully, she rose from the chair, her steps noiseless against the wooden floorboards. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, but beneath it all she could hear them, 2, maybe 3 figures moving outside, one near the porch, another near the back window. Clara crouched low, moving to the hallway without turning on a light. She had lived in this house long enough to know every creak in the floor, every shadow cast by the moonlight spilling through the curtains. At the front door, A faint pressure tested the lock, a hesitation before retreating. They were checking entry points, testing her defenses. She eased the hammer of the Colt Python back, the quiet metallic click lost beneath the sound of a stray car passing distantly on the road. She waited. Then a tap against glass, subtle, probing. The back window. Clara moved quickly but silently, her breath steady, her mind clearing into the old familiar state it hadn't entered in years. The Circle's men weren't amateurs. Their movements were coordinated, disciplined. She felt the echo of her past tightening around her like a second skin. The first man came through the window. His silhouette slipped in with practiced grace, a shadow against the faint glow of the yard. What? Clara waited until both of his boots touched the floor before stepping forward from the darkened corner. The barrel of her revolver pressed cold against his temple. Not another move, she whispered. The man froze, startled not by her words but by the certainty in her voice. Hands where I can see them. His gloved fingers rose slowly, reluctantly. Clara's eyes flicked to the side. Another shadow moved by the porch. How many of you? She asked, her voice low, measured. He didn't answer. She pushed the revolver harder into his temple. Answer. A long pause, then a muttered, 3. Clara almost smiled. They had underestimated her. Before she could disarm him, the second intruder pushed the front door open, lockpick tools clattering against the floor as he stumbled in, clearly not expecting his partner to be compromised. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired once, the Colt's bark exploding through the quiet house. The bullet slammed into the floorboards inches from his boot, splinters flying. He froze, eyes wide in the dim light. Step inside. Slowly, Clara commanded. Both men obeyed now, their earlier stealth shattered. The third man lingered outside, perhaps reassessing. Clara backed toward the kitchen, keeping the revolver steady. Shut the door behind you, she ordered. The second man hesitated, but a flick of her barrel urged him to comply. The click of the door closing echoed like a gavel. You made a mistake coming here, Clara said, her voice calm, almost eerily so. The first man sneered, though his voice shook. You think one old revolver's going to stop the Circle? At that name, Clara's eyes hardened, the faintest flicker of old pain crossing her face. I don't need to stop the Circle, she replied. I just need to remind them who they're dealing with. Her words landed heavy, and both men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected a frightened woman, maybe a panicked civilian. Not someone who moved like she had, not someone who held a weapon with such unshakable control. The third man entered through the back at last, silent but purposeful, a knife glinting in his hand. Clara turned just as he lunged, his blade flashing toward her. She stepped back, the revolver swinging in her grip, and fired. The shot cracked through the kitchen, the bullet grazing his arm and sending the knife clattering across the floor. He hissed in pain, clutching the wound, but Clara didn't flinch. Pick it up, she warned the others, and I won't miss next time. The revolver never wavered. Years of training had returned to her body like muscle memory, guiding her stance, her aim, even her breathing. The men looked at her not as a target anymore, but as something far more dangerous. An equal, maybe even a superior. For a long, taut moment, the four of them stood in the kitchen, the silence broken only by the dripping of blood from the wounded man's arm. Then Clara spoke again, her voice like steel wrapped in calm. Tell whoever sent you this, I'm not afraid. And if they want what I have, they'll have to come themselves. The first man swallowed hard, his earlier sneer gone. He knew she was serious, and more than that, he knew she wasn't bluffing. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands higher. We were told you'd be easy, he admitted. They said you were just some librarian now. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Then they've forgotten who I am. Or maybe they just never knew. She motioned with the revolver toward the door. Leave. The men hesitated, exchanging looks, weighing whether retreat was worse than failure. But the revolver in her hand, steady as stone, convinced them quickly. One by one they moved toward the door, their movements slow, deliberate, eyes never leaving her. Clara kept her weapon trained until the last shadow slipped into the night. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Only then did she lower the revolver slightly, though she didn't holster it. Her body was steady, but her mind raced. This was just the beginning. The Circle had tested her defenses, prodded at her resolve, and now they would return with more. They always did. Clara locked the door behind them, her hands precise, her breathing slow. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. She had warned them, but warnings only went so far. The Circle never quit, never forgot. They would come again, stronger, more ruthless. and she knew she could not stand alone forever. She opened the lockbox once more, pulling out the files she had sworn never to touch again. If the Circle wanted to drag her back into their world, she would meet them there, but on her terms, not theirs. She placed the revolver beside the files, staring at the weapons of her past laid out on the table. The woman mocked in a gun shop earlier that day was gone completely now. What remained was the soldier, the operative, the survivor. And when the Circle returned, they would find not a frightened woman, but the ghost of their own making, armed, ready, and unafraid. The quiet inside the gun shop didn't last long. For a moment, everyone seemed frozen in time, still stunned by what the simple woman had just done. The broken bottles, the dented cans, the clean cluster of holes in the paper targets, all of it stood as undeniable proof. She wasn't just some random lady in plain clothes. She was someone who had spent years training, someone who knew what she was doing with a firearm. The tension was thick, and you could almost hear the collective thought running through everyone's minds. Who exactly is she? The manager cleared his throat, trying to find words that wouldn't sound foolish in front of the gathered crowd. Ma'am? I don't know where you learned that, but that's some of the cleanest shooting I've seen in a long time. He sounded both impressed and uneasy. The clerks, who had mocked her earlier, avoided her eyes now. They busied themselves with meaningless tasks, rearranging papers, straightening displays, anything to hide their embarrassment. The group of men who had laughed at her earlier no longer looked amused. Instead, there was an uneasy respect in their eyes mixed with shame. They had underestimated her, and now they couldn't undo their mistake. But the woman didn't say anything. She didn't bask in their silence or gloat over their discomfort. She simply placed the gun back on the counter with quiet precision, as if she were setting down a delicate piece of glassware. Then, without hesitation, she walked toward a shelf lined with ammunition boxes, studying the labels as if she had been planning this all along. She picked up what she needed, brought it back, and calmly placed it on the counter. Her face remained composed, not betraying a single emotion. She behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though the incredible display of skill had been a routine act. That, more than anything, unsettled the others. They had expected maybe a nervous smile, maybe some proud boasting, or at the very least a quick explanation. But she gave them nothing. Her silence was more powerful than words, and the respect in the room grew heavier with each passing second. One of the younger men finally broke the silence. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying both awe and nerves. The woman didn't look at him. She simply shrugged and answered in a calm, almost distant tone, "Some things you learn when you need to survive." She didn't elaborate. She didn't owe anyone her story, and the mystery only deepened. Everyone leaned in, hungry for more, but she offered no further detail. The man who had mocked her most harshly earlier shifted uncomfortably. His arrogance had drained away, replaced by something close to fear. He tried to cover it with a forced laugh. "Well, guess we all underestimated you," he muttered. But his laugh fell flat and no one joined in. The power in the room had shifted. She was no longer the target of jokes or whispers. She was the one they all now measured themselves against. When the clerk rang up her purchase, his hands trembled slightly as he handled the boxes of ammunition. He tried to force a smile, but his eyes never met hers. "Will that be all for you today?" he asked softly, almost deferentially. She nodded once, placed the cash neatly on the counter, and waited patiently for her change. The manager stepped in, refusing to let the clerk handle the money alone, and personally counted out the bills with great care. His respect for her was evident in every gesture. The other customers in the store didn't dare move, afraid to draw her attention. The woman's calm, steady presence filled the space, and it was as if the walls themselves leaned closer to her. She gathered her purchase, placed it carefully into a plain cloth bag she carried with her, and then, for the first time, looked up at the group that had mocked her. Her gaze was steady, not unkind, but piercing. She said only one sentence, "Don't judge what you don't understand." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it landed with the weight of iron. No one replied. No one even breathed loudly. The words sank deep, and the silence that followed was absolute. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps unhurried, her back straight. Not a single person dared stop her, not a single whisper followed her out. Even the air seemed to hold its breath until the sound of the door chime faded behind her. Only then did the room exhale. The men who had mocked her glanced at one another, shame written plainly across their faces. The manager shook his head slowly as though he had just witnessed something rare, something worth remembering. One of the clerks muttered, "I'll never forget that," but his voice was barely audible and no one responded. Everyone knew the truth. They had all seen greatness disguised as simplicity. They had laughed at someone they didn't understand, and in the end she had left them all speechless. Outside, the woman walked down the street, blending into the crowd as though nothing had happened. She looked like any other person carrying a simple bag, her clothes plain and unremarkable. Nobody passing by could have guessed what she had just done or the lesson she had just delivered. To the world she remained invisible. But inside the gun shop, her presence lingered long after she was gone. Every person in that room carried the weight of her silence, the sharpness of her skill, and the echo of her words. It would be many weeks before anyone in that store laughed at another customer again. And even then, whenever they saw a simple face, plain clothes, or quiet demeanor, a shiver of memory would return. Because they knew now that sometimes the most ordinary-looking person carried the most extraordinary power. And in that small gun shop, on that quiet afternoon, a simple woman had taught them a lesson they would never forget. The silence in the gun shop stretched like a drawn bowstring. Martha stood there with the pistol still in her hands, her chest rising and falling with deep, deliberate breaths. Every person in the store, whether clerk, customer, or bystander, remained frozen, watching her as though she had become something more than herself, something untouchable. For so long she had been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked. But now her quiet strength radiated through the air, and no one dared to break it. The owner finally found his voice. He approached slowly, not with arrogance this time, but with the respect one might give a veteran soldier. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you handle that weapon better than most men who walk through this door. I don't think I've ever seen someone so composed under pressure." His words weren't flattery, they were honest, almost humbled. Martha lowered the pistol gently, engaging the safety, and placed it back on the counter with reverence, as if she were setting down a sacred relic. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The quiet confidence in her expression said everything. Across the room, the man who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably. His smirk was gone, replaced by the uneasy look of someone who realized he had gravely misjudged a person. He tried to open his mouth, maybe to excuse himself or cover his embarrassment, but no words came. For once, silence served him better. Martha glanced at him, not with hatred but with something far heavier. Pity. He shrank under her gaze. That pity stung worse than any insult, because it reminded him of his own cowardice. For the first time in his life, he felt small before someone society had taught him to dismiss. The clerk who had hesitated earlier now stepped forward. "Would you like to see another model, ma'am?" His voice was softer, careful. Martha nodded, and he brought out a different pistol, slightly heavier with a longer barrel. She inspected it with steady hands, checking the chamber, the balance, the weight. She aimed again, this time toward the range at the back. Every move she made was precise. She had no training certificate on her wall, no uniform, no badge, yet she carried herself like someone who had lived through storms most of these people couldn't imagine. She fired once. The crack echoed through the range, followed by a small cloud of smoke. When the paper target was reeled back, the shot had pierced cleanly through the bullseye. The room inhaled as one. Then she fired again. And again. 3 more shots, each one perfect, each one biting into the same circle as if the bullets themselves respected her command. By the time she set the gun down, the target was nothing but a ragged hole. The clerk swallowed hard and whispered, "Unbelievable." No one laughed now. No one dared roll their eyes. Even the air felt different, as though charged with an invisible electricity. Some of the younger men shifted awkwardly, trying to reconcile the sight before them with their prejudices. A few even looked ashamed. Martha turned and walked back toward the front, her face calm, her shoulders relaxed, as though she had merely finished an everyday chore. But every eye followed her. Near the door, a mother with her teenage son stood. The boy looked at Martha with wide eyes, almost reverent. "She's amazing," he whispered to his mother. The woman nodded silently. Martha overheard but said nothing. She didn't need to bask in praise. She had proven her worth, not to them but to herself. That was enough. Still, the respect around her was undeniable. Even the man behind the counter, who moments ago had doubted her, now spoke with sincerity. "Ma'am, if you ever want to come by, the range is open to you anytime. No fee." Martha paused, turned her head slightly, and gave him a single nod. It wasn't acceptance of a favor, it was acknowledgement. She had earned this shift in tone, and she would carry it with quiet dignity. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the bell above the door jingling faintly, the silence inside the shop lingered. No one moved until the door clicked shut. Only then did whispers break out. "Who was she?" someone muttered.